ATC 102 clearance delivery, our second slideshow for our observer students working towards S1. Position jurisdiction clearance delivery is responsible for the following: processing flight plans, amending flight plans per LOA, SOP, or required per Virtual Air Traffic Control System Command Center. And that would mostly be for our event type routing. Issues IFR clearances and in certain cases beacon codes and or departure instructions for VFR aircraft. Flight plans and the flight plan information through CRC. What you're going to see is the flight plan editor. When you pull this up, you'll typically see the aircraft call sign, a beacon code that we will assign if necessary, aircraft type, equipment suffix, departure, destination airports, filed airspeed, altitude, and filed routing. The remarks section will include things like voice capability. Sometimes guys will also put other comments in there, new to VATSIM, that sort of thing. Equipment suffixes are codes used to indicate specific equipment and capabilities of an aircraft. Typically provides the following information: whether or not the aircraft is RVSM equipped and capable, their navigation capabilities and avionics on board, and whether or not they have a transponder or a transponder with mode C, which is altitude encoding. Common codes are slant Lima, which is going to be our GPS GNSS type aircraft that is RVSM capable. A slant Whiskey, which is a non-RNAV or non-GPS aircraft, but also RVSM capable. That aircraft would need the ground-based navigation, VORs, NDBs, intersections. Our slant Golf, similar to the Lima, our GNSS equipped aircraft, likely GPS equipped, but is non-RVSM, meaning it can't cruise between 290 and level 410. And our slant Alpha aircraft, that is a non-RNAV aircraft, also non-RVSM. So similar to our slant Whiskey, needs the ground-based navigation. Table of our aircraft equipment suffixes. Most of these diagrams and pictures, those sorts of things, are in the training packages, so have a look for those. You can see our Lima, our Whiskey, our Alpha, and our Golf described here. Another one that you might see is a slant Alpha. For instance, a Cessna 152 or a small prop that does not have GPS is non-RVSM but has a transponder, might be a slant Alpha. Other aircraft that come onto the network filing codes that you think may be incorrect. For instance, a slant X-ray, non-RVSM, no DME, no transponder, is likely simply incorrect. Most pilots on the network that use some sort of flight planning software like SimBrief will usually have these suffixes correct, as long as you're using an aircraft profile. If incorrect, you can ask the aircraft to say their equipment type or equipment suffix or their navigation capability, and usually decipher which suffix that aircraft should have. And that will be part of your job as the delivery controller to make sure that that information is entered correctly. Also, direction of flight and altitude rules. This is something else you're going to need to make sure is correct. Out of the 7110 4-5-2, assign cruising altitudes to aircraft in accordance with this table. Acceptable VFR cruise altitudes follow the same rule as IFR, except we add 500 feet to the altitude. Below 3,000 feet above the surface, this rule does not apply. Therefore, aircraft can file and fly at any altitude on any magnetic course. At and below level 410 on an easterly or a southerly heading, we say northeast odd, southwest even. You'll probably hear that a lot. On a 0 through 179 magnetic course, odd cardinal altitudes or flight levels at intervals of 2,000 feet, because we're going to have opposite direction, 1,000 foot or 1,000 foot above or below. So an example would be 3,000, 5,000. And then westerly, the 180 through 359 degrees magnetic, even cardinal altitude or flight levels at intervals of 2,000 feet. So for instance, 4,000 and 6,000. Above flight level 410, we're going to go to 4,000 foot intervals beginning with flight level 450, and then the westerly beginning at 430, and you can see the examples there. Direction of flight, continuing on here. Note, when not obvious, and I want to emphasize when not obvious. Obviously, Tampa is east of Chicago, Salt Lake City is west of Chicago. Northeast odd, southwest even. Direction of flight is based off how each track leaves the ZAU airspace or remains within the ZAU airspace, meaning an aircraft, let's say, is going to Peoria. Not a great example. Peoria is actually part of T-75 St. Louis Tracon, but we'll just use that as an example. That would still be a westerly altitude, but we do have some C-track aircraft, meaning Comiskey, Karen, Sybil, and Pocket City, that are westerly aircraft, or sometimes even easterly aircraft on the C-track that may not be obvious, but that's kind of where we're going at with this here. The following yellow line separates the west-east headings based off of fixes. The west and east headings based off of the fixes. Our even altitudes will be our Pumpkin. We're going to start here at the top. I got Pumpkin, Mikey, Noonie, Owen, PQ, Aceto, Bacon, and Comiskey. And our odd altitudes, Dent, Earned, Lukey, Mobile, Duffy, E-Bake, and Rayner. We're going to get into this chart a little bit more here later on. A great resource also for you is going to be the FlightAware website, our IFR route analyzer. And if you type in the departure and destination airports, you'll see with frequency how many times that particular route had been filed for that airport. And if we scroll down on the page a little bit further, you can even see filed altitudes. And so you can see that the Comiskey or the C-track has a mixture of even and odd altitudes. But when obvious, as we said previously, Atlanta, Tampa, we would want to give those aircraft odd altitudes, unless of course they're on the C-track landing or remaining within the ZAU airspace. RVSM airspace in the 7110 2-1-29, which stands for Reduced Vertical Separation Minima, is any airspace from flight level 290 through flight level 410. All RVSM capable aircraft are separated by 1,000 feet in RVSM airspace. All aircraft below RVSM airspace is separated by 1,000 feet. All aircraft above RVSM airspace must be separated by 2,000 feet. So you can think of it as the surface to flight level 410 is 1,000 foot of vertical separation opposite direction. It's not until we get above flight level 410 do we start applying the 2,000 foot of vertical separation. And RVSM airspace came into existence some time ago now, but level 290 through 410 and up all used to be separated by 2,000 feet. So what RVSM did was compress level 290 through level 410 from 2,000 foot of vertical down to 1,000 foot of vertical. That's what RVSM is. Non-RVSM capable aircraft cannot cruise in RVSM airspace, only climb and descend through. They must be separated by 2,000 feet with all their aircraft while doing so. RVSM airspace is directly linked to the direction of flight rule, so our east odd, west even rule. And of course, above level 180, all those aircraft are IFR, so the VFR would not apply. For the purposes of VATSIM, all aircraft are considered to be RVSM equipped and capable, unless it would be obvious. For instance, a Cessna 152, a single-engine prop aircraft that would have a service ceiling of somewhere around 11 to 12,000 feet. Obviously, cannot achieve flight level 290. So at a glance, RVSM airspace, again, from the surface to flight level 410, 1,000 foot of vertical separation. Once we get above flight level 410, we go to 2,000 foot of vertical separation, opposite direction. So as the delivery controller, we want you to pay special attention to aircraft that file above flight level 410 to make sure that we're giving proper altitude for direction of flight above RVSM airspace. Lowest usable flight level from the 7110 4-5-4. If a change in atmospheric pressure affects the usable flight level in your area of jurisdiction, use the table below to determine the lowest usable flight level to clear aircraft at or above 18,000 feet MSL up into the flight levels. For instance, lowest usable flight level, if we had an altimeter, let's say, of 2980, you'd be in the middle column there. You can say that the lowest usable flight level that day would be flight level 190. And you can see that this really only becomes applicable once the altimeter is 2992 or lower, because all aircraft, once they reach 18,000 feet, set standard on their altimeter 2992, so that they're all using the same altimeter setting to maintain that 1,000 foot of vertical separation. If you happen to notice an aircraft that would be on the network and filed a lower flight level, such as 180 on a day like that, you might want to say something along the lines of November 4, 902 Hotel Sierra, flight level 180 unavailable for the altimeter setting. Would you prefer 6000 or flight level 200? Because the lowest usable flight level in that case would be flight level 190, since they can't use 18,000 feet for proper direction of flight. They would have to use either 16,000 feet or flight level 200. Give the pilot the option. Back to our departures fixes diagram chart here. On the right side, it says, note the initial fix that is on the O'Hare 8 or Midway 7 departure follow a track out of the ZAU airspace. Some routes may not follow the track all the way out, as they may be landing in the ZAU airspace or be following an LOA route. For instance, an aircraft that was filed out of Midway going to Iowa City would not need to fly, obviously, all the way out to Rotten or Ogale to come back to Iowa City, is what we're trying to say there. In the case of our routing to St. Louis, you can see we've got an A track, Aceto, Adele, Arwen, and St. Louis, and you can see that track here, Arwen out to St. Louis. You notice that it does say Acme here, but there is a caveat there where it says Bloomington, Peoria, Springfield only. So in that case, we would skip over Acme if that aircraft is not going to one of those airports. Some fixes may not be used in the route as there are special instructions below. And another example might be the P's over here, leaving west out of the green as South Sat. It says here Sector 1 Midway. Aircraft going over PQ would only go to Pig if they were also then going to Quain and on to Carrot. If they're going to Pippin or Obene, we would simply route them through or past Pig. Let's say PQ on to Pippin, Rotten, Pawnee. And you can see that's how we get aircraft out of our airspace per our policy. So this is a great diagram to show you all the departure tracks out of the ZAU airspace. You as the departure controller, the delivery controller, when you're reviewing the routes and issuing possible route amendments, this is how you're going to want to look at your routes on the front side of the routing, how the aircraft leaves our airspace. Then, of course, in the back side, we'll have LOA routing with different airports and different facilities. Looking a little bit further at the diagram, you can see the green here. It says South Sat Midway. So all the green ones here, PQ, Aceto, Bacon, Comiskey, Den, Ern, Lukey, Pumpkin, and Rainer would all be on the Midway 7 departure. The whites here, C90 satellite sectors and airports, the whites, or the browns is North Sat, so Milwaukee, Waukegan, and a couple other airports there. For instance, the white ones are all going to be on the O'Hare 8 departure. Pumpkin, Rainer, Mikey, Nooney, Owen, PQ, Aceto, Bacon, Comiskey, Den, Earned, Mobile, Duffy, E-Bake, and Rainer there. You can notice that Lukey is green only. There's no white or brown, so the North Sat and C90 satellite sector airports, O'Hare does not use Lukey. Also depicted in the red is the NavAids or the non-GNSS for Slant Alpha, Whiskey, and Zulu type aircraft. Those red ones are going to be VORs. So we got Piatone to the south, for instance, Badger to the north, Polo, Iowa City, Keeler, Gipper, different VORs. And again, a lot of those should be on the O'Hare 8 and Midway 7 departures. Non-RNAV procedures are Slant Whiskeys. Non-RNAV, non-GNSS. They do not have methods of navigation that allow aircraft to go to a specific set of coordinates using onboard navigation sensors such as GPS to determine aircraft position. So our Slant Whiskeys will require ground-based navigation, as we mentioned before, VORs, NDBs, or VOR intersections. Slant Whiskeys are, however, RVSM capable. LOA routing may be available for Slant Whiskeys in our documentation, but if not, use SkyVector to find VORs for the aircraft. And just a quick example using the SkyVector website, what I just threw in here quickly was Midway to Memphis. Not necessarily proper routing, just wanted to show you how you can go on SkyVector and throw in some VORs there and get some information about track. And for instance, here our first fix is going to be Piatone. EON, so our first bend there is where the Piatone VOR is, and then of course you can see Roberts down here and the different depictions of the VORs on a low altitude and route chart. Flight strip procedures, your instructor in your sweatbox will show you how to use the flight strips and what we want you to put on the flight strips. Flight strips are a key tool used by air traffic control to manage and coordinate the movement of traffic within their airspace, provides essential flight information in a concise and organized format. The strip will have 9 boxes on the right side of the strip itself. The rest is not editable on the website through vStrips, but the 9 boxes are. And so working as clearance delivery only, we're going to want you to put in the top left corner the ATIS code. So say, for instance, ATIS Charlie is current. Once the aircraft calls in with Charlie, we would put a C in that block. Ground runway intersection, skipped over PDCs. What we're going to want you to do there is if you issue a PDC, to type PDC in that box. Otherwise, if you've issued a verbal clearance, we'll put an X in that box. And as the ground controller, once you get to that point, when we assign a runway and possibly an intersection departure of a runway, we'll put that information there. So perhaps 4L for 4 left in the runway box, and maybe a W for whiskey intersection departure. Moving on to clearances, IFR clearance phraseology. IFR clearances, as you probably remember from the Academy, may be broken down to an acronym known as CRAFT, Clearance, Limit, Route, Altitude, Frequency, and Transponder. All clearances follow that format. Usually, the aircraft's destination is the clearance limit, but it can be a certain fixed navigator waypoint. Routing will be, of course, the aircraft route is cleared to fly, which may include a SID, a standard instrument departure. Altitude will usually include an initial altitude after departure and a subsequent altitude, or the cruise altitude, with any restrictions in order. So perhaps maintain 3,000, expect level 340, 10 minutes after departure. The 10 minutes, of course, is for lost communications procedures. Frequency, the active departure control frequency, which may be Unicom of 122.8 if there's no overlying radar controller online, and the assigned beacon code. So as we said, all of our clearances will follow the CRAFT format, and an example in the bottom will be that first we would give the call sign, who we are, midway ground, cleared to, and then whatever the clearance limit is likely an airport. Via, and what the routing may be, we'll give that routing, the amended route, or maybe simply as filed. Altitude information out of Midway or Milwaukee. Milwaukee will be 5,000, Midway would be 3,000. And likely the cruise altitude 10 minutes after departure, departure frequency, whatever that might be, and the beacon code. Delivery should attempt to issue IFR clearances as soon as practical. If it's not immediately available, instruct the aircraft to wait by saying something like Southwest 2264, Midway delivery, clearance on request, standby, or standby number 2 if they're multiple in queue. If the clearance becomes available from the next few minutes, read the clearance to the aircraft. Otherwise, you might want to say something along the lines of Southwest 2264, clearance available, advised, ready to copy. That way the aircraft is actually listening and you don't have to repeat yourself multiple times. Clearances must be given in the order requests were received, except when an operational advantage is gained by prioritizing a later request. VFR departure instructions should be given with no delay, as they are much simpler. And we'll show you that phraseology. Clearance items 4-2-1, again, this is following the 7110. An example for you, as filed, destination is Seattle-Tacoma International Airport using the Midway 7 departure. They filed that route string there, which we're satisfied with. Departure frequency, altitude, and transponder code. South 318 Midway delivery cleared to Seattle-Tacoma via airport via the Midway 7 departure. Radar vectors PQ, then is filed. Maintain 3,000, expect level 360. 10 minutes after departure. Departure frequency 119 or 0.0, squawk 2554. Note the Midway 7 departure states climb on assigned heading for radar vectors to filed or assigned route or depicted fixed. It is, of course, a radar vectored SID, and the altitude is read as 10 minutes for the final altitude. We always want to break the numbers up, times, altitudes, frequencies. The only thing that we combine in this case would be the call sign, Southwest 318. I want to try to eliminate as many filler words as possible. We don't want to say South 318 moved over. You are cleared to the Seattle-Tacoma Airport. We can eliminate filler words. So it would be best for you to recite and practice your clearance phraseology so that you can get rid of the filler words and those sorts of things. Route amendments. If an aircraft's route of flight is incorrect, we may have to give a route amendment, which changes the original filed route to a route amended by the controller. Note, anything that is changed or added to the route must be spelled out phonetically. Amend the route or of flight in a previously issued clearance by one of the following methods. 1. State which portion of the route is to be changed, and then state the amendment. For instance, change blank to read blank. It might be change Lukey to read PQ. State the amendments to the route and state the rest of the route is unchanged. So the amended route and then rest of route unchanged. So cleared to the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport via the Midway 7 departure. Radar vectors pumpkin, Papa Mike, Papa, Kilo November, direct, whatever the next fix is, rest of route unchanged, or you could say then as filed. Issue a clearance direct to a point on the previously issued route, clear direct blank, or direct destination airport, or you can simply issue the entire route. This, of course, is for verbal clearances. Using the PDCs is much easier, but in the sweat boxes, we want to get you to master your verbal clearances first. Continuing on, this is with an amendment. So we have an aircraft that's filed to Indianapolis. We're going to always issue the Midway 7 departure, unless, of course, it's a tech en route airport, and we'll cover that momentarily. The incorrect route that was filed and the correct route that we're going to give in its place. Departure frequency, filed altitude, and the transponder code that was generated by CRC. Southwest 2234 Midway delivery clear to the Indianapolis International Airport via the Midway 7 departure. Radar vectors earned. Echo Alpha Romeo November Delta. Direct laner. Echo Lima Alpha November Romeo. To join the JAX 2 arrival, maintain 3000. Expect fall of 21010 minutes after departure. Departure frequency 119.0. Squawk 1052. So we're going to spell out each fix amended. We're going to say direct in between each fix that is changed. We do not have to spell the SID or the star because those are published charts and should be easily found by the pilot and referenced by the pilot. Our departure procedures, we have 4 different types of SIDs. We'll start with the radar vectored SID. The aircraft receives vectors or headings to fly to one of the fixes on the departure procedure. And the tower will typically assign a heading to fly with the takeoff clearance. The aircraft is told to maintain an altitude that they will climb to and stop at. If there are crossing restrictions on the radar vectored SID, the aircraft is told to climb via SID. The Midway 7 does not have crossing restrictions, therefore we would just simply say maintain, and it's also published on the chart in the initial climb and top altitude sections. There's also speed restrictions on those charts if you were to read closely. Looking at the chart, I know it's probably a little harder to see if you pull one up individually. You can see the different RNAV fixes: Pumpkin Rainer to the north, PQ to the west, the A, B, C, D, E's to the south, and Lukey to the east. Those are our RNAV fixes. You can see the VORs on there as well: Northbrook, Badger, DuPage, Piatone, Roberts, Gipper, Iowa City to the west. Those are going to be our non-RNAV fixes. The O'Hare 8 allows us to tell the pods to climb via SID because we have the 2 range rings here with the altitudes. At 3.8, I believe it is, the aircraft is supposed to be at or above 3,000 feet. And then at, can't see the distance there, 5.8, I believe it is, up above 4,000 feet. Therefore, we would say climb via SID. We want the aircraft to be above those altitude restrictions by those distances from the Chicago VOR. And there again, you can see the RNAV fixes on the O'Hare 8, Pumpkin Rainer, Mikey, Nooney, Olin, PQ, our A, B, C, D, E tracks to the south, Mobile, Duffy, and E-Bake to the east. So in your clearances, we're always going to issue those departures with one of those fixes. Pilot Nav SID, we do not have any of these in the ZAU airspace. This is an example from Atlanta, shown with transitions or branches. Aircraft are cleared on the SID with a specific transition. Similarly to the radar vectored SID, if there are speed restrictions or crossing restrictions, aircraft should be instructed to climb via SID. If there are no restrictions, aircraft are cleared on the SID along with the transition and told to maintain either a top altitude or a facility-specific altitude. On this chart here, it does say top altitude 10,000 feet, and a textual description of that initial routing for that SID. Hybrid SIDs is a combination of the pilot nav SID and a radar vectored SID. We have 2 of these at Milwaukee, just to the north of O'Hare, the Acra 5 and the Euchre departure. Aircraft will be vectored to the first fix on the pilot nav portion and then told to resume the departure. So tower would assign a heading departure would then eventually tell the aircraft to fly direct to that first fix, likely vZAU, and resume the departure. Aircraft cannot be told to climb via SID in this case because there's nothing to climb on to or climb via on the radar vectored portion. Instead, they'll be told to maintain an altitude or a top altitude. In the case of these departures here, they'd be told to maintain 5,000. However, once they get cleared direct to the first fix on the pilot nav portion of the SID, there are crossing restrictions. You can see Wennell at or above 11,000 feet, KG at or above 13, and Levens at or above 16,000 feet. Then the aircraft will be instructed to climb via SID by the departure controller. Obstacle departure procedure, created where an aircraft is in close proximity to obstructions such as mountains. Procedures are designed to avoid these obstacles before proceeding to the cleared route. Crossing restrictions may not be waived by ATC because ATC cannot move mountains. So you can take a look here, the Teton 3 departure out of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And in the initial climb down here, it'll tell the aircraft exactly what they're supposed to do and what altitude to climb to before proceeding on the route or while flying the route. Next, notes on departure procedures. All RNAV capable aircraft must be routed on an RNAV fix as their first fix. This specifically does apply to vZAU. We want to make sure that those aircraft are routed on an RNAV fix if RNAV capable on the Midway O'Hare departures. Not all aircraft will fly the procedure all the way, usually when they're landing at a nearby airport inside of our facility. We talked about that. Route all aircraft on the departure procedure as long as they are capable, most of which, if not all, should be capable. All aircraft should be able to navigate either an RNAV fix or a VOR. Some specific information about Milwaukee itself. We have 3 SIDs that are used, the Acra, the Euchre, which are both hybrids, and the Mitchell 9, which is a radar vectored SID. The Acra 5, climb on assigned heading for radar vectors to vZAU is what it will say in the initial climb. An example, clearance phraseology, Southwest 1854, Milwaukee delivery, clear to the St. Louis Lambert Airport via the Acra 5 departure, then is filed. Maintain 5,000, expect level 210, 10 minutes after departure. Departure frequency 118.0, squawk 2254. Our Euchre 6 departure states climb on assigned heading for radar vectors to perfect. Southwest 1854 Milwaukee delivery cleared to the Indianapolis International Airport via the Euchre 6 departure. Sample transition, then is filed. Maintain 5,000. Expect level 210, 10 minutes after departure. Departure frequency 118.0. Squawk 2254. And the reason we have to say sample transition is because there are 2 transitions. So we're going to want to make sure that we specify the proper transition. It's likely that the pilot filed that transition anyway. The Mitchell 9 departure or radar vector departure has multiple exit points or departure gates. We've got them listed here at the top: JX, Grease, Bubbler, Hawkins, Cindy, Brave, and Squibb, and you can see where those are at on the departure here: JX, Cindy, Squibb, Brave, Grease, Hawken. Southwest 1854 Milwaukee delivery cleared the Grand Rapids Airport via the Mitchell 9 departure. Radar vector Squibb, then is filed. Maintain 5,000. Expect level 210, 10 minutes after departure. Departure frequency 118.0. Squawk 2254. Very similar to our Midway departure. Midway information, some specifics here. Departure out of Midway, we have 1 active SID, the Midway 7 departure. All aircraft are climb on assigned heading for radar vectors to the filed assigned route or depicted fix. Maintain 3,000. Expect filed altitude 10 minutes after departure. All that is written right here in the initial climb box with a top altitude of 3,000 feet. So as long as pilots have charts and are assigned the Midway 7 departure, they should be reading this information, including the speed restriction of 250 knots till advised by ATC. Example clearance phraseology for the Midway 7 for an aircraft Southwest 2618 Midway delivery cleared to the Minneapolis International Airport via the Midway 7 departure. Radar vectors Pumpkin then is filed. maintain 3000, expect level 32010 minutes after departure, departure frequency 119.0, squawk 2254. Of course, we would listen for the readback from that pilot. As long as the readback is correct, we would say readback correct, and maybe remind them of a few items, ATIS information. And your instructor in the sweat boxes can give you some more detail on that. SOP LA review out of the Midway Air Traffic Control Tower SOP under 3-1, duties and responsibilities for clearance delivery. Issue IFR clearances consistent with an initial fix and altitude depicted on the appropriate SID, unless the aircraft is landing within the Chicago C-90 TRACON airspace. Those are our tech airports we'll talk about shortly. Check flight plans for correct routing and amend as necessary to comply with the C-90 Midway LOA. If routes are amended after clearance has been issued, ensure that the pilot receives the amendments. If possible, clearance should be issued via PDC using the TTLs and the website. If departure clearances cannot be issued via PDC, issue the clearance verbally. In your sweat boxes, everything will be done verbally. Once you're certed, then you can use the TTLs, which will make your life a lot easier, especially for route amendments. Assign beacon codes and the appropriate departure frequency. Process traffic management initiatives. Coordinate with local, which is the tower, any helicopter requesting departure from a movement area other than a runway. That would be a taxiway, of course, a movement area. We're also going to want to coordinate a non-movement area, departure from a ramp. Again, your instructor will teach you or show you how to do your coordinations with local. Our air traffic control tower LOA with C-90, the C-90 Midway Air Traffic Control Tower LOA. Midway procedures for tower and route control airports. So this is going to be our airports, our aircraft that are going to depart an airport under C-90, which is at the Chicago TRACON, landing in another airport underlying the C-90 TRACON. Midway must, meaning you or the tower controller, ground controller, only issue clearances that contain the first fix after departure when that fix is on the current Midway SID, RNAV capable aircraft via the appropriate RNAV waypoint, non-RNAV capable via appropriate conventional nav aid, so likely a VOR. In accordance with the table below, when aircraft are routed through or landing in tower and route control airports as defined on the next page. So our aircraft that are not landing inside or underneath the C-90 airspace will be on the Midway SID, routed on an appropriate waypoint, whether that's RNAV or conventional. If they're landing inside the C-90 airspace, we're going to route them as defined on the next page. We'll get to that next. The last point I want to mention is at the bottom there. When clearing an aircraft without a SID, assign an initial altitude 3000 and expected requested altitude 10 minutes or 10 minutes after departure. So on the next slide here, let's get into the tech airports. The table on the left side would come out of the LOA between C-90 and the Midway Air Traffic Control Tower, and the top line there, C-90 Tech at or below 15,000 feet. Destination Chicago Terminal Area Airports. They can request any altitude, doesn't mean they're going to get it, but they can request any altitude. And the first fix will be the OBK, which is the Northbrook VOR north of Milwaukee, or via radar vectors. So we'll give you an example here. I have an aircraft that's going from Midway to DeKalb, or I guess we'll use DuPage here, Midway to DuPage. We're not going to use the Midway 7 departure because we don't do that for the terminal area airports, our tech airports. So an example clearance would be November 772 Lima Charlie Midway delivery cleared to the DuPage Airport via radar vectors. Maintain 3000, expect 4000, 10 minutes after departure. Departure frequency 119.0, squawk 5354. So again, you can see our tech airports, we do not issue the Midway 7 departure, as they are not going to fly out to that departure gate at the edge of that airspace. They're going to remain inside the C-90 TRACON for the entire flight. Letter of agreement routing is a set of routes that aircraft must fly from the LOA departure airport to destination airport through signed documentation. These are, of course, all on the website and in the training packages. You can look at the LOA agreements, documents. They all have tables that describe the routing. Your instructor will show you those documents. Controllers must follow these routes and are depicted in the training package. LOA routing is typically with airports and the surrounding facilities, of course, Indianapolis, Cleveland, Minneapolis, and Kansas City, or very busy airports, JFK, Newark, LaGuardia. And the reason that we have those with those airports is because Cleveland has an LOA with those airports. And so our agreement with Cleveland is that we will route the aircraft the way that New York wants Cleveland to route them. An example, midway to Indianapolis, we would file, or the pilot, we would give a routing of Earned, Alainer, and the JAX 2 star into Indianapolis. And from Midway to St. Louis would be over Bacon, Blocker, Roberts, and Arch 2. You'll get very used to these LOA routes the more you work the position. Again, we're going to use the C90 Milwaukee Terminal Area Departure Routes Fixes diagram on the front end of the routing to satisfy our requirements to exit the airspace. But we're going to use the LOA documentation and the tables for the back end of the routing for LOA type airports. For instance, Minneapolis here. If they're coming from the vZAU 60 or 64 sector or vZAU 75 sector, you can follow across there. We'll use the top one, 60, 64, and RNF type aircraft should be routed on the Killer Star. The altitudes you do not need to worry about. That is the center to center border or boundary crossings. Not anything that you need to worry about. Simply make sure the aircraft has followed the proper altitude for direction of flight and move on. The qualifiers there, how do you know where those sectors are? We've got diagrams for you that we can share. For the most part, aircraft will be routing on the Killer Star. On our next slide here, we do have a diagram or picture here just depicting those high center sectors there. 60, 64 would be Badger to the north, 75 Cotton to the west. And on our Killer Star, they exit up here into this corner. That's why when we say 60, 64, we're going to have them on the Killer because that's where the Killer routes. And of course, the other star comes out this direction. That's why. Again, a great resource, the route analyzer. If we plug that in midway to Minneapolis, you can see 45 times here frequency shows Pumpkin, Nito, Dillon, Ronick, Kama, and the Killer 3. And of course, those are all going to be westerly, so even altitudes. Another great resource for you when you're trying to figure out what kind of routing these aircraft should be on. This, of course, pulls real world data. Obviously, if it's proper for the real world, it's going to be proper for us as well. VFR procedures, VFR flight plans, VFR or visual flight rules. Aircraft are allowed to fly during weather conditions when the pilot, that allows the pilot to fly looking outside the cockpit. Note VFR conditions in ATC 101 general. What we're talking about there for the most part is our VFR cloud clearance requirements and visibility requirements operating in different airspaces. Generally speaking, or very typically, it's 3 miles of visibility and the ability to be 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, and 2,000 foot horizontal of clouds. As long as the pilot can maintain those cloud clearance requirements and has the proper visibility for the airspace, they can fly VFR. VFR aircraft do not have to submit a flight plan on the vZAU network. If the controller is to create a VFR flight plan for the pilot, solicit following information: aircraft type, equipment suffix, altitude, and their route. Sample of a VFR flight plan on CRC. What we've got here is an aircraft call sign November 123 Alpha Bravo, a type of Cessna 172 with an equipment suffix of slant Golf or a G. Our pilot told us that he's flying from Midway to DuPage, 70 knots airspeed, and a VFR altitude. If we knew specifically what altitude he wanted, say 5,500, we can actually do a VFR/055 for the altitude. Otherwise, simply VFR will suffice. And a route of VFR West. In the remarks there, you can see he's a voice pilot with the slant V/. VFR phraseology: leaving a Class Delta airport, pattern aircraft should remain on a VFR beacon code. For instance, November 223 Lima Charlie Dubuque delivery, squawk 1200, contact ground for taxi. Or if you're working ground and delivery top down, November 223 Lima Charlie Dubuque ground, squawk 1200, call for taxi. Aircraft departing at Delta, aircraft departing VFR from a Class Delta airport that does not want flight following is not required to contact a radar facility. Therefore, a VFR aircraft in this scenario is not given any type of clearance and receives taxi instructions only. Transponder code and departure frequency will only be issued if the aircraft requested flight following. So for instance, November 223 Lima Charlie Dubuque ground departure frequency 120.35, squawk 3446. Because obviously the aircraft is going to need to talk to center in this case and have a beacon code for the radar controller to be able to track the aircraft. VFR phraseology: departing Milwaukee, pattern aircraft should remain on a VFR beacon code, same as before. Departing aircraft will be giving an altitude restriction per the Milwaukee Air Traffic Control Tower SOP 5-1F. Again, those documents are in your training package. Look under the SOP folder. Departure frequency and assign a VFR beacon code per the SOP in a range of 4600 to 4677. Currently, CRC does not provide for these codes, but my understanding is that is still in the works. For now, we'll just use the CRC assigned beacon code. Example, November 223 Lima Charlie, Milwaukee ground, maintain VFR at 3,500, departure frequency 118.0, squawk 4600. And the altitudes at which you would assign would depend on what they file and refer to the table in the SOP 5-1F for those altitudes. On a midway pattern aircraft, same. Should remain on a VFR beacon code. Departing aircraft will be given an altitude restriction, departure frequency for flight following only, and assign a VFR beacon code per the C-90 Midway Air Traffic Control Tower LOA with a range of 5101 to 5177. An example, November 223 Lima Charlie, Midway delivery maintained VFR at or below 2,000 while in the Chicago Charlie airspace, squawk 5101. If they wanted flight following, we would include that departure frequency. And this one never changes in terms of the altitude. We're always going to give maintained VFR at or below 2,000 while in the Chicago Charlie airspace. That's a phrase that you'll want to get familiar with, very familiar with. Special VFR aircraft, when a pilot requests a special VFR departure, obtain necessary information recorded in the request in the flight plan and the requested direction, the altitude, or I'm sorry, the route field of the flight plan. All SVFR instructions will be issued by the tower. Instruct the special VFR aircraft as follows. November 223 Lima Charlie, Midway ground or Midway delivery. For a special VFR departure, squawk 3226. Expect special VFR clearance from the tower. Call for taxi. Handoff phraseology: you as the clearance delivery controller eventually will want to hand that aircraft over to ground. There's several ways that we can do that. You can say November 123 Alpha Bravo, contact Midway ground 118.07. Simply contact ground 118.07 or simply contact ground. Seeing as you are Midway delivery, handing off to Midway ground, same facility name, we don't need to say Midway ground. We can simply say contact ground. And that'll complete ATC 102 clearance delivery.